Hello, everybody. It's 4:30 Brussels time, so we will start this webinar now. I am Peter Weiss. I'm a senior advisor at Rud Pedersen Public Affairs, who are putting on this webinar. And we're being sponsored by the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. The webinar series that this is the fourth episode of is called Carbon Management. And this time, the theme specifically is carbon neutrality and how we're going to get there, or climate neutrality, actually. The first thing we should be careful of is that climate neutrality, of course, covers all greenhouse gases. Carbon neutrality covers CO2 only. And I think we'll come across that again when we compare 2050 goals or 2060 goals, whatever. First of all, I'd like to introduce the panel. We're honored to have member of the European Parliament, Pernille Weiss, who's a Danish member of the EPP group, and she's a member of the Envy Committee and also ITRA, the Industry Committee. So in the Parliament, she's got, as many parliamentarians have, a lot of committees to attend. Secondly, I'd like to introduce David Hohn, who is the Chief Climate Advisor at Shell, the oil company. Thanks for joining us, David. David runs a very interesting blog, by the way, on which I got some ideas for this webinar. And finally, I'd like to welcome Jake Werksman from the European Commission, from the Climate Action Directorate General. Jake is a former colleague of mine, of course, because I used to be in the Commission, and he's very expert in all of the international negotiations, among many things else. So, and Joanna, my colleague, Metz, is also here to help me moderate the session, fielding questions from the audience. And I do invite you to ask a question in the chat panel if you'd like to. And then we've also got one or two polls just to get a little bit of feedback from you, the listeners, because it helps us know what you think. Now, François-Régis, I can't see you on the screen. François-Régis Mouton is the Europe Director. Now, François-Régis, hello, of the IOGP. Would you like to say a word now, or are you going to conclude? Which is your preference?
No, I think we decided, Peter, that I would do just concluding remarks, but I welcome everyone and thanks a lot to all of you, including Pernille, Jacob, and David, to be part of this last webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Well, I'm going to kick off with a very political question. I'm going to address this, if I may, to Pernille, who is the politician on the panel. We know that Donald Trump has said repeatedly the US is going to leave the Paris Agreement. It looks very likely this is going to happen very soon. What should we do about that? I mean, the biggest economy in the world, the second biggest emitter in the world, just walking away from an international agreement. What do you think about that?
I can have nightmares about that, to be honest. And since we are that close to the American election, I think all we can do right now is actually to pray for the American voters to do the right thing, both for their economy, but also for the climate of the globe. Because you are so right, Peter. We need US to stay put to the Paris Agreement, and also to build up a more solid kind of neighborship, and also toolbox sharing between EU and US, where we can show how the market mechanisms actually work as the strongest muscle for the climate change. Also because a lot of the way our businesses work, the relationship between researchers and industries, SMEs, and politicians, we are known to this kind of, I guess it's a kind of a trilogue actually between politicians, business people, and researchers to do the innovative revolutions and also iterative initiatives that we can actually do to show that we can still live in a free world with peace for everybody, but also to heal the climate and the biodiversity also by the way we do our choices as citizens, and also the efforts that our SMEs and businesses and industries put in. So, of course, we need for US to stay put, and also that is why, and that would be my concluding remark to your question, it is so important that we in EU now will have a solid climate law. We voted it, the Parliament's position last week. It still has some way to go until we have reached an agreement with the Council. But if we can succeed in having actually the world's first continental climate law, that will also be a role model for the US citizens and businesses to say, okay, if the Europeans can do it, so can we. Let's co-create. Let's use the EU climate law as also a role model for us to do. So, and we need that to go into the COP26 next year as well, because the message in COP25, I was there in Madrid myself, was please EU, show us how to do it. You must go as the first movers, both politically but also innovative in how to change and use the market mechanisms to heal the planet. So that's my take. Let's pray and prepare.
Right. Thank you. I mean, one of the ideas, of course, I think there's general public support for this for climate neutrality in 2050 in Europe. The public is with you. But the businesses are a bit worried about the costs of regulation. And one idea that the president of the European Commission has put on the table is a border adjustment mechanism whereby imports would be charged something, a levy or some such extra charge to take account of the carbon in the products. Now, I want to run the first poll now, Joanna, if you would be so kind as to put that up on the screen. And the question is basically, this CBAM, by the way, is an acronym for this Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But I mean, in the context we're in now, we've got Europe signing up to 2050 climate neutrality. China has announced that it would become carbon neutral by 2060. So the question is, how should Europe react with a border adjustment mechanism? Perhaps this is intended for countries that are free riding, and if the US were to leave the Paris Agreement, they might be deemed as free riding, although a lot of good things are going on in the States. But of course, other people say Chinese products are carbon intensive, and indeed from Southeast Asia more generally. So please run through those potential answers, whether or not the carbon border adjustment mechanism should be on imports from the US, but not China, just an idea, or from China, but not the US, because lots of good things are happening in the US, but China has a lot of coal. Or the third option, which strangely I can't see on my screen, but I guess if I scroll down, it's something like both of them, basically. Yes, both US and China. Wow. So far, if those answers are anything to go by, can you see the answers and the panelists? It looks as if CBAM on energy intensive imports from both the US and China would be something that gains participant support. And of course, that is designed to be to help the competitiveness of European industry. But Jake, perhaps I can come to you next. Tell me, if Europe were to go down this road of having some sort of border adjustment, is that going to make the international negotiations under the Paris Agreement easier or harder?
No, thanks for that question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, really well.
Excellent. Well, as you know, Peter, the Commission has announced its intention to propose a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we're working on an analysis of what exactly that might look like. We're not expected to deliver that design until sometime next year, and it wouldn't be actually implemented for a number of years later. But we're very much at the design phase. We've got the sort of political directions that are coming from on top, which is essentially that we in a context in which we know the level of ambition in the EU is far ahead of many of our trading partners, we need to take measures to address the specific concern around carbon leakage. The idea that if the cost of production of certain products within the EU is significantly higher because of our regulation, our climate regulation within the EU, we may need to make an adjustment at the border to take into account that difference in carbon price between a product produced in the EU and a product produced in other countries. It's interesting that your poll shows that maybe the audience has also been listening to the other part of the political direction, which is that this measure, when it's put in place, has to be WTO consistent.
Yeah.
So we can't discriminate between otherwise like products simply on the basis of the country of origin. And your questions, two of your questions, led to such a distinction, where you were favoring a product from.
I get it.
So
we've got a lot of WTO experts online. That's great.
There may be some trade lawyers on the line there. So again, we can't go into the details yet because we're still assessing different options. But most border adjustments of this kind, when they've been thought about in the past, they make distinctions between products, not between the country of origin. And so the question would be, is this particular piece of steel that's being imported into the United States, regardless of its country of origin, experiencing a higher carbon price or lower carbon price than is being experienced in Europe, in the country in which it's being produced? These have always been very controversial measures. Any trade-related measure is likely to attract a lot of political attention, and this kind of a measure is politically sensitive in part because it's making distinctions on the basis of a process and a production method rather than the physical characteristics of the product. And that kind of measure has run into WTO issues in the past. And so that's why we're so concerned to design this policy in a way that we're confident will be WTO compatible. But as a result, those politics will spill into the climate change negotiation.
That's my question.
Yeah. And how they would affect the Paris dynamic, I think, is unclear. I mean, I think that the proposal has made some of our partners nervous. And that in part is its intent, to show that we are serious about taking the lead, but we're also very conscious that we can't solve this problem on our own. And as long as we're well ahead of our trading partners, there will be this question about an unlevel playing field and the risk of carbon leakage. So I think many of our partners are seeing it as an impact or an effect of our leadership. And understand that we do have to design our policies with that in mind.
Okay. But I would think that countries like India and perhaps other developing economies, they don't think this. I don't think they're going to like this because they should get special treatment, shouldn't they? They are not. This common but differentiated responsibility concept is that the industrialized world, the developed world, has created this problem. And countries like India are just beginning to be significant producers now. But I suspect that's going to be tricky, isn't it?
The politics around that will be tricky. I mean, Paris does say that it is up to each party on the basis of its own national determination to decide the level of ambition that they will commit to under the Paris Agreement. Yeah. And guiding that is a principle that we need to take into account common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, but in light of different national circumstances. That's an element that Paris brought into the mix as well, which means you don't just look at the development status of a country, but you look underneath that general category to what's happening within that country, and included within that is the extent to which they are regulating greenhouse gas emissions. So
well, and David, I come to you next. The method of measuring emissions. If we're going to be measuring emissions, process emissions in third countries, we're going to need to know a lot of data. This isn't how emissions are normally measured, is it?
No. Just to check, you can hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yep, good. No, emissions are normally measured at a country level or by, at a facility level by the amount of fuel used. But I think, looking at this problem, it's a little bit counterproductive, because it is sort of being constructed on the idea that other countries aren't taking any action. And I think one of the difficulties is assessing the way in which a country is taking action, which of course, as was just mentioned, that's how the Paris Agreement is constructed. So the EU has a very transparent carbon price, so it's very easy to see. But in another country, you might have a high requirement for renewable energy, which is creeping in, the cost of which is creeping in through the electricity sector, not as a carbon price, but as a general tariff on electricity. And so, how do you make that assessment? That cost is still being borne by the industry in that sector. How would you differentiate between California, that has a trading system, and Texas, which has a broad range of measures to push wind into the electricity sector?
Yeah.
Just as an example, not to defend anybody or anything, but so I think it sort of sounds good in practice, or in theory, but I think in practice this is going to be extraordinarily difficult to measure. Not from the difficulty of measuring the CO2, you can calculate that, but in determining what is climate action and what is the level of the CO2 price, whether it's explicit or implicit because of other policies.
Yeah. Pernille, you've been listening to the discussion. Do you have any thoughts? I don't know. It's a bit unfair to ask you what you think of a carbon border adjustment mechanism when nobody can explain to you what form that would take. But is your instinct that this kind of mechanism's needed?
I don't have that kind of instincts, actually.
No.
Maybe that's a failure to my nature. I'm curious, but I also, having spent a lot of years in the building industry working with evidence-based design processing, and also the research of how to improve energy efficiency, I think that the BAM can be used as kind of a leverage by saying, okay, if we cannot do anything else, we will have to do like this. But the message I get from the industry and the researchers as a whole is we don't know everything about what we should do, but we know a lot. What we need is actually the framework, also cross sections, sectorials, and cross country. If we can get the energy union in EU to work 100%, that will improve the chances for cutting down emissions in EU very, very, very profoundly. Yeah. And in that respect, I'm very happy that one of the parts of the climate law that was voted last week was actually, and it is a hidden jewel in the law, is that we succeeded from the EPP side to have the suggestion of sector-specific climate partnerships to be designed in EU. We have them in my little country, Denmark, but the message coming also from a lot of industries is we need EU and the Commission and US politicians to facilitate much more in between industries and in sectors to understand what stones need to be taken out of our shoes, what is actually needed to be done, but also to let actually the movement grow from the industries and all the citizens actually working every day in their job, improving the future for the next generation with whatever they do. Either they work in a car factory or they work wherever else you can do. So I guess what is very, very relevant is to see how can we enforce more reliability in how we learn from each other. That was also addressed from the previous speaker, that how can we actually mirror ourselves in each other's role models to learn how to go the extra mile for the environment. Because if we cannot make the comparisons, then we do not have also the initiative and the incentive to actually lift each other. But that is actually what is needed to be done. And that's also why I'm very, very happy that in the climate law, there is also this climate council, the EU climate council idea, that we will improve experts' voice to give advice to most often to us politicians, because the industries and the researchers, they know what to do. It's more or less sometimes a matter of how we as politicians can step up and come up in the forefront of the bus in every sector.
Yeah, thank you. You're right that there's in Europe as well. We do have a whole host of policies which are overlapping to some extent. You know, we've got energy efficiency standards, we've got renewable standards, and we've got this emissions trading system, about which I just want to talk a little bit more, if I may. One of the things the Commission has said is if there is going to be an adjustment at the border for imports, then free allocation should cease under the emissions trading system. And so that's something that has to be sort of digested by industry. And is this really what industry wants? That's one question they can answer for themselves. But the emissions trading system as a whole is one of our instruments. It's the one that it's a big one. It covers the biggest emitters. And basically, I'd like to just talk a bit about that, because it's some tool that's been in place now for 15 years. And between now and 2050, it's going to go another 30 years. But in that 30 years, the allocation or the permits that are issued under the emissions trading are going to be squeezed down to zero. I mean, that's logical, isn't it? With a net zero target, there is no allocation. Now, David, if I can just ask you how you see the development of the emissions trading system over the next decades, not next year,
Yep.
but over the next decades. Is this going to become a sort of smaller and smaller system and in the end be discontinued because it doesn't serve any purpose, or has it got a life beyond the issuing of these allowances?
So I think it has a very important life beyond the issuing of allowances. So you're absolutely right. Around 2050, the issuance of allowances will cease because the linear reduction factor will take you to that inevitably. However, that's unlikely to align with the point at which emissions cease. And that's simply because, you know, the range of technologies required to bring emissions to actual zero, in some cases don't exist yet. In other cases are far from mature. So the EU, for instance, is just starting to build a pilot plant for a hydrogen steel plant, steel smelter. You know, will all the steel smelters be replaced by 2050? There is no plane in the sky yet of any size that flies on that emits nothing or has zero emissions. So I think, you know, emissions will continue. So what that means is that the system has a very important role balancing emissions that are remaining with removals that have to come into the system. And so the trading system has to evolve to be able to do that. And the way that happens is to introduce a removal unit into the system. Now, there's no point just introducing that in 2050. The squeeze will start probably in the 2030s, as much of the power generation system is already decarbonized, and the options left for immediate decarbonisation start to dry up. And so you want to start to encourage the development of removals, you know, well before you actually need them. So this removal unit system plays an important role. And so beyond 2050, you've got this system that's then balancing sinks and sources. And then, of course, even has the potential to go negative overall, so that the EU could be a net negative emitting region, which may then become an important export for the EU itself, so that you're balancing other countries and you're selling them reduction units as well. You know, it's probably going to be quite late in the century before everybody everywhere has sorted all this out.
Yeah.
So, you know, some regions are going to have to be negative, I think, for a while. The EU ETS can manage that.
Okay, it's exciting. I think you're right that by 2050 there will be quite a few sources of emissions still in Europe, and we have to find some way of compensating for them, so that we're net zero. Another sector of emissions that is likely going to still be emitting in 2050 is from agriculture, from things like meat production, where it's anticipated the emissions will continue due to rising global population. But also in Europe, we will have emissions from that sector that we need to compensate for. But removals, we've had the last webinar, we discussed carbon capture and storage, and utilization, but removals, apart from forests, you know, there aren't many technologies that can do it yet, are there? Is Shell doing anything on the removals front?
So we do have a number of pieces of research ongoing around air capture. So the trick in removals is capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's, you know, it's simple from a sort of a chemistry point of view, but complicated from a mechanics and thermodynamics point of view. So actually building a system at scale.
Yeah.
Now, one type of system already exists in the world and already removes CO2 at scale. And there is an ethanol plant running today in the United States. The processed CO2 that comes from that ethanol plant is captured and geologically stored. And they're storing 1 million tons of CO2 per annum, and so removing CO2 from the atmosphere, because that carbon came from the atmosphere when the corn was initially grown for the ethanol plant.
I see. So ethanol from corn, from maize, as we call it in England, in the UK.
Now, that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, always abbreviated as BECCS in all the IPCC.
Okay. So it's nature doing the removal, and in fact this plant is ensuring the capture and storage.
That's right. Now the more challenging way to do it is to capture CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. But there's a lot of venture capital going into this technology in all sorts of parts of the world. You know, from Iceland to Switzerland to the United States and Canada. A number of companies are looking at this. It's easy and difficult at the same time, because scaling up at a reasonable price is yet to happen. But, you know, once venture capital money starts to go into things, remarkable things can happen.
Yeah, that's been true of renewables in Europe. Yeah. But tell me, I mean, the emissions trading scheme, how does that come into this? I mean, would these operators establish themselves in Europe, issue certificates that have been through, I suppose, this regulatory certification scheme that was mentioned in the Circular Economy Action Plan for 2023? Europe is planning to put in such a regulatory framework. Would the emissions trading be a kind of accounting system where, you know, these removals were sold to companies?
Yes.
Like so the steel works.
The price of a removal will emerge out of the emissions trading system. Companies will buy the units. Now, air capture could take place in Europe, but it could also take place somewhere else with geological storage. You know, maybe very low cost, maybe much lower cost to do this in the Middle East or in Australia, or, you know, in the deserts in California or wherever, or in Europe. You know, I'm not, but nevertheless, you know, if you can certify the geological storage, then this is a very valid removal for anybody to use anywhere in the world. And Article 6 can be the funnel of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 can be the funnel with which it comes into Europe.
Okay, and just in case any of the listeners don't know, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is an article that allows for these cooperation mechanisms where reductions or removals happen in one country and they are sold to emitters in another country to cover emissions. So right. Article 6, it's a little bit of unfinished business out of the Paris Agreement, isn't it, Jake? Hasn't there been a couple of failed attempts to resolve this so far?
Yeah, we are still working on it, and a couple of key pieces. One is the way in which parties will account for those transactions that have just been described. So when units, allowances pass between countries, how are they going to make sure that no two countries are claiming the same reductions towards their Paris Agreement targets? That's one issue that we're still working our way through generally. And then specifically, we have to design the project-based mechanism that will certify offsets that are being produced on a project-by-project basis in certain countries for international transfer and use. And that's essentially trying to kind of upgrade and improve on the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, but in a way that's fit for the Paris Agreement. And fit for the Paris Agreement means that it has to deal with circumstances in which a host country has its own targets. Remember, under the Kyoto Protocol, it was only the industrialized world that had legally binding targets, and so they simply purchased offsets from developing countries, and the developing country host didn't have to account for the transfer of the emissions reductions to the developed country, but under Paris they will. And so here we have to make sure that there's no double counting between hosts and investor countries as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Jake. You explain it well. And I'm going to come to Pernille and say, hang on a minute. Just tell me, Pernille, I can't remember, but I don't think the climate law foresees all of this credits from overseas. Isn't it a domestic target, climate neutrality in 2050 and the 2030 target? We're not going to use these offsets, are we?
You're actually, you're right, Peter. And actually, that was one of the things that was pointed from my group, the EPP, and that is why I'm very happy also of the third part of the EU climate law proposal from last week is that we will have an impact assessment done in 2023 to the 2040 target, and where we have stressed from the EPP to shed light on exactly the questions raised here on the international aspect of the trading system, because it doesn't make sense to anticipate that EU is the same as the whole globe, and that EU, if not, is an island that is independent and everything independent to everything else on the globe. So that's the closest I can get to your point right now, Peter.
Okay, David wants to say something, which is great. You follow on.
Very quickly. So, Peter, putting aside that the EU sort of has qualms about this, the linking directive that you probably wrote is still active, and there are ways in which a link could be established between a regime that's creating removals. So I think the law is already there.
Yes, it's true, but the linking directive, as you call it, was the first amendment to the emissions trading system, so as to allow there to be these CDM credits from the Kyoto Protocol. Those were the old credits, and gradually, in Europe, we got too many of them. They flooded the EU trading system, and the price fell very low, and we had doubts about the quality of those credits, of those reductions. So we've kind of gone off. The emissions trading scheme as of next year doesn't take any overseas international offsets. And I guess, are we going to use them or not? I think the jury is out.
I think Article 6. I think if we don't, it's expensive for Europe in the long term.
True. That's one of the big reasons why offsets are appealing, is that they're cheap. But of course, they've got to be good quality, or they're, you know, or they're cheap for that reason. But Jake, I haven't heard anything about international offsets.
No, you haven't heard it from the Commission proposal or from the Parliament's amendments to that proposal. So at least up until 2030, I think the EU is behind a domestic-only target. But I think it's important to really take note of the difference between the Kyoto world and the Paris world. And part of that we've already begun touching upon, which is Paris commits us all, in theory, to be climate neutral as soon as possible. And after the middle of this century, and and some countries have come forward with specific dates for that. So the EU 2050 climate neutral, as you pointed out, China is saying 2060 to be carbon neutral. The Joe Biden climate plan, if those are interested, has a 2050 neutrality goal in it as well. So countries are being more and more specific. But what that means is, in essence, is that none of us can really rely upon emissions reductions happening elsewhere, because the planet has to be climate neutral by the middle of the century. And so you have to reduce those emissions first and foremost at home. There may be a transitional period, as has been pointed out, where we may be either relying upon other countries' emissions reductions, or we may be going emissions negative and opening up an opportunity for other countries to rely upon us reducing our emissions lower than net zero in order that they can continue to emit for a while. But the bottom line there is this planetary boundary is that we all have to be net zero. So this opportunity to rely upon other countries' emissions reductions is a window that's closing very rapidly. And it's a question that we put to companies that are saying that they are intending to be climate neutral as well, particularly if they're heavily dependent on the production of fossil fuels, how they intend to do that in a world that's going climate neutral.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's so many issues around the emissions trading system, but one of them is that international aviation is going to be offsetting its emissions from next year under the mechanism called CORSIA. So there will be some other buyers of these offsets. If it isn't Europe, it's going to be these international airlines who are flying international routes. But again, we'll have to see how that evolves as well. And I guess the Europeans will be looking to see how that experience goes before any big questions are asked in Europe about whether we do it ourselves. Anna, can I just pause and ask you if there are any good questions that you've picked up from the audience? I see a few, but I can't see them all. Joanna, over to you.
Yes, thank you. We have questions, and I think you actually addressed quite a couple of them. But for example, continuing on the ETS, there is a question that what if the price of the carbon removal will remain higher than the price of an allowance due to unforeseen design flaws of the ETS? And how will we incentivize carbon removals then? And as you just briefly touched on aviation sector, there's also a question from the maritime sector that whether the maritime's transportability to circumvent carbon pricing measures by sailing outside of EU's territorial waters will not disadvantage European shippers.
Okay, well, perhaps I put the first question to David, if I may, and the second to Pernille. Would that be all right? A bit about maritime, because I know you've been working on the maritime file in the ENVI committee recently. David, the question then was, supposing the cost of removals, is going to be higher than allowances.
So I think we were talking about this in the context of ultimately no allowances.
Yeah.
So what you should see, and I think the EU ETS has always reflected the market circumstances of the day. We may not have liked the price of €3, but it was reflecting a circumstance of the day. It reflects today a circumstance of today, which is that gas can substitute coal, yeah, and you're seeing a price that is forcing that to happen. So I think as you head towards 2050, if you have this mechanism in play, you would start to see the price of allowances converge with the cost of removals, so that the removal and the allowance became the same thing. That it must happen, because unless you've got an out for somebody, that you know, an escape hook for somebody. I think the Commission's been pretty good at, you know, recognizing when they appear and then getting rid of them again. You know, we've had them before, and they've disappeared. So I think the EU ETS is solid in that respect, and as long as the removal unit, not offset, removal unit, is designed correctly, it will work.
Right, and thank you very much for that, David. Just so that everyone is on the same page, a reduction of emissions is just the lowering of emission that was taking place down until it is zero. A removal goes below zero. A removal is somehow capturing CO2 that's in the atmosphere, either through natural or through technological ways, and putting it somewhere. So it's a subtraction. It's like maths. And so those are the differences between the reductions and removals. I just think it's so important. And you were talking all of the time there about removals. And indeed, that's something that we're going to see more of, I hope, as technology costs come down. The other question, Pernille, was about maritime and how shipping might try and avoid any European charges by, let's say, unloading in Turkey and putting it on a lorry and shipping it or driving it across Europe. What do you think? Should we include maritime into the emissions trading system?
Yes, but we must do it in a proper way, and that's one of actually the fights in the Parliament on how to do it. And just this morning, in a opinion report on CO2 reductions in the maritime, we had this fight again. Because my position, the EPP position, is that we will look forward to see the impact assessment that the Commission is working on right now on how to include the maritime sector in the ETS, and then to propose how to do it by June 2021 at latest. And from history, we know that after a proposal is put forward, we will and also to make proper legislation around it, it will take another 2 years, so that the ETS inclusion of shipping into the to the ETS will be most probably first in 2023. But until then, and also just to state the fact that the ETS is not a miracle powder. The innovation is happening when researchers and the industry co-creates with each other how to use modern technologies and new energy sources, and also with in the terms of the MRV, in the shipping, to use the MRV tool on how to decarbonize the way shipping is being done. We have seen very, very good results, a position of high priority from EPP to actually use what drives innovation and cuts down CO2 emissions, instead of just putting shipping into the ETS and then wait until something happens. It doesn't work like that.
It's true that reductions of emissions happen through technology, but the ETS sometimes can incentivize those investments in technology.
Exactly.
Let's just ask a poll question to everyone listening. The second poll question, Jana, if you could possibly put that up and remind me what the question is, please.
The question is that while a flagship EU climate policy, the role of the EU ETS will likely change, and what should the change look like? The options are that the EU should put more emphasis on the EU ETS as a policy. The EU should put less emphasis on EU ETS as a flagship policy. And thirdly, the EU ETS should be replaced by an economy-wide carbon tax.
Yeah, I mean, when I started, thanks very much. When I started on climate policy in the late 90s, we were talking about taxes at the time, not emissions trading. And it was the Kyoto Protocol that somehow prompted us to change from taxes, which couldn't be agreed, to emissions trading, which might be agreed. And in the end, it was agreed. But it's not something that has won everybody's hearts and minds. It's had problems over the years, but it looks now as if the Commission, anyway, is planning to put more emphasis on the emissions trading system. And the audience is asked to sort of give your opinion whether it is right in putting more emphasis on the EU ETS, or whether it should put less emphasis on the ETS, and perhaps it should scrap it altogether and put a tax in, because the tax debate's still going on in some jurisdictions. Right now, in a rather specific way, it's going on in the UK, because they're having to disconnect with the emissions trading system from the end of the transition period, and there is a question as to how they will replace it in the short term. Even if in the long term they want to come join again the emissions trading system, they might have to do something in the meanwhile. But look, the results seem to indicate to me there's a lot of support for extending or putting more emphasis on the emissions trading system. Now I'm going to ask a question again, perhaps to Pernille, if I may. One of the ideas the Commission has is to put buildings and transport into the emissions trading system. What do you think of that? Because you're interested in buildings, you've said so already, and you are also interested in the renovation initiative that's soon to come out of the Commission. What's your feeling about the emissions trading?
Oh, I don't like feelings in
okay.
in that.
Rational.
I like, in that regard, I really would like to work a little bit more with facts. And just to have if I can make a comment to the poll just made, it actually shows, I think, that we need to understand a little bit more in depth what can we use ETS for, and what can we use the carbon tax for. But because it's not an either or, it is that I have, that much I know, is to see where does it fit in which sector. And then going to the building, being the carpenter's daughter, but also being skilled and have had a long career in the building sector, it is well known that the ETS will not drive innovation and improve energy efficiency of the building stock. That comes from actually doing the renovation. Create new jobs, put new windows, new technologies, smart digital solutions to how to work with the energy consumption, and etc. There are so many already known technologies on how to improve the CO2 cut and to cut down on energy and to raise energy efficiency of the building stock, that if we use the ETS as a tool, that will actually make the member states, if we take the EU hat on, to not push for more energy renovations. They already don't do it as much as they have promised each other. We promised that state-owned would be renewed by 3% annually. It's only around 1% right now. So we really need to push for more energy renovation projects, because that is how you cut CO2 in the building sector. If you use the ETS, nothing will happen, and we will not have all the fruits from the efforts made. By 1 million euros spent, you can create 18 jobs. We need that right now because of the Corona recovery. You create more healthy jobs, better homes for people with low income, better nursing homes, better schools, so that can improve the ability for the conditions for children to learn what the teachers say. So there are so many efforts that you can harvest from energy renovation that you will not have if you include the building stock into the ETS. So I think we really need to understand, for what is ETS worth. It's good in aviation, it's good in transport, it's good in the maritime sector, but also it must balance with what are the new technologies, what are the new energy sources coming up, because it must not slow down the speed of development and research and innovation.
Yeah, I'm sure Jake will be reporting back to his colleagues in DG CLIMA what you're saying. David, I saw you were eager to join that conversation. I heard Pernille say that nothing would happen if buildings came into the emissions trading system.
So buildings use two types of energy for the most part. They use electricity and they use natural gas. So electricity is already in the emissions trading system. So why would you have it there twice? And natural gas is really used in boilers and for cooking. Now, a building standard would take care of boilers. So if you stop building houses that use natural gas, then you'd stop. And equally, if you imposed a restriction that, when you replaced your boiler, you had to put an electric one in, which we had to do in our own home because of UK flue regulations had changed over the years, then you also head towards electricity.
Yeah.
Separate to that is the question of efficiency. That they are interlinked, but let's not always just bundle efficiency and emissions into the same box. Sometimes they are quite different things. But yeah, don't forget, electricity is already in the emissions trading system. So if you build a house that uses electricity, it's covered.
That's true. Although you could reverse the argument and say because electricity is in the emissions trading and gas isn't, you could almost include gas supplied to buildings in the emissions trading, perhaps. I don't know. Jake, have you got any reactions about this? I mean, the 2030 communication didn't say much. It came out in September. It didn't say much about the Commission's real intentions. But is this really just a sort of an idea that's flashed through someone's mind, or is it something people are really working on, the buildings and in the ETS?
I'm sure people are thinking and working on it, but I would agree with the other panelists that this is a sector that is for many reasons much more complex than many other sectors in terms of the number of technologies that are involved, the incentive structures, whether you're talking about owned housing or rented housing.
Yeah.
It's a very, very complicated sector, and it's one that I think requires multiple policies to try to get emissions under control. So ETS already applies, as David points out. Taxes are being used at the member state level to drive some of these incentives, and of course we have appliance standards, efficiency standards as well that come into the mix. So I know that people are thinking about it, but I'm sure in the course of the coming 6 months, as we're thinking about how the ETS is revised, it will be recognized this sector is more challenging than just about any other sector to create the right policy framework around.
I think that was pretty well flagged as well in the recent European Parliament's own initiative report on maximizing energy efficiency in the building stock. There's a lot of complexities, as you say, Jake. But I would think that those who advocate inclusion of buildings into the emissions trading system are not suggesting that we should deregulate. All of what exists would continue to apply. And I suppose the same would be true of transport. If transport was to come into the emissions trading system, if road transport was to come in, then I don't suppose that they would discontinue the CO2 standards for cars and lorries, and, or there would really it wouldn't just be an additional regulatory step, it would be a replacement regulatory step. And, it couldn't afford to go wrong. So really, I would say it's astonishing how much is hanging on this package of measures next June. There's a huge amount coming. There's a lot of energy efficiency legislation, because the renovation wave communication that's coming out on Wednesday this week is going to, in the end, be another communication that details a whole list of actions. The actions are what we're really waiting for. I'm sure in the Parliament, Pernille, you're dying. You've got the climate law now. You're negotiating that. You've got the budget. But I bet you're dying for a whole load of other legislative proposals from the Commission so that you can get super busy before the end of the mandate. That's typically what happens, isn't it?
So I have been told. I mean, this is my first term, and I know that there are 3.5 years until next election. But I can feel that the Parliament is actually like horses in a start box, that we really would like to work now on the European Green Deal and begin to deliver legislation and regulations, whatever, so that we can in very short time show the voters that we actually react to their demands, and also to show the industry that we do listen to what they need from us to improve even more on the CO2 reductions and also the biodiversity and whatever the environmental targets. What energy efficiency directive and the revision hereof. Just before this session, this meeting here, we had a talk in the ITRA committee with the Commission person, Van Steen, on that part as well. So there's a lot of strings attached to the goal of healing the climate and improving how the balance is between emissions and reductions.
Thank you. You're going to be busy, Pernille, that's for sure, which is great. Now, I've got to draw the conversation to an end now because I'm going to invite François-Régis Mouton, the Europe Director of IOGP, to say a few words of conclusion to the series. François-Régis, if you're online, perhaps you could turn on your camera. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was fighting with the camera and all the rest. I apologize.
No worries. Over to you, François-Régis.
As for the climate neutrality objective, we're all clear about this objective. We all want to go there, but the question remains actually how can we go? Which pathway to get there we need to go? And today, I realize that we are just scratching the surface of all that, and most efforts have to be achieved in the power generation sector, or just in the power generation sector, but not only there. We need also to find the right ingredients, and this will take time, the right balance. And we are also discovering the limitations of some technologies. So far, we insist a lot about decarbonizing the power sector with wind and power, but we realize we need to go much beyond that. And then therefore, we're rediscovering the potential of other solutions, such as some that were deemed to be forgotten, like CCS, hydrogen, and we will need to balance the strengths and weaknesses of all the different technologies. And our industry and the energy industry in general is certainly not ideological, dogmatic, no. And this is why many of our members are diversifying at the moment, Peter, and demand patterns are evolving, and then we are following them. We are expanding in renewables, utilities, batteries, hydrogen, you name it, but we are very aware that we'll need to balance post-2030 remaining emissions, and even in 2050, as it was said today, with removals of emission to reach climate neutrality and even go negative, as it was again mentioned today. And therefore, these carbon removal technologies are very important, including the large-scale solutions such as CCS. And this is exactly why the political framework needs to remain flexible and inclusive enough. So I wanted to thank you all, and I don't want to touch about CBAM on the revision and inclusion of the EU ETS of building and transport, because it was very well mentioned before. And thanks, I'm very happy to see that Pernille was already in the starting block with all the EP for this legislative year. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot, Jake, and thanks a lot, our friend David, for participating today. And I'm sure just a start of very interesting discussion that will keep going on, and we'll be happy to be involved into that. Thanks a lot to you all.
Thank you, François-Régis. Thank you, panelists, and thank you to everybody who's been listening to this conversation. It's been a pleasure. All the very best. Bye.